Good morning, church. We began this series asking this universally troubling question: how is it possible to reconcile belief in a God who is perfectly good and all-powerful with the reality of pain and suffering and evil in the world? How can all three parts of this paradox, as presented on the slide, be true? And we saw that there's a number of inadequate answers given by other religions or from popular culture, even from some things that said in the church. And then we started on this 8-part answer to our question. We saw the first and the very foundational part of the answer is this: that the creation of a real world, which cause and effect, the law of consequences, operates, shows us that some pain is due merely to the fact that the properties of the universe are constant, and that the possibility of choosing evil was a necessary construct of this world. And the second part was this: we saw that the introduction of evil into human history through the exercise of our free will brought about our estrangement from God. And as a result, we are all broken. We're all cut off from the source of life, from the knowledge of what is good and true and right. And in our brokenness, then, we act in a way that brings damage and pain to ourselves and to others. So consequently, much of the pain and suffering in the world is due to the effects of human sinfulness on the natural world, to the sinful choices of people that you and I, things that we've done, and the consequences of those choices, including the systemic and universal integration and enculturation of evil as sin becomes a part of a culture and dominant in that family or group or tribe or society. And that brings us to the third part of this answer. Last week when we read the story of Adam and Eve, the narrative that tells us of the introduction of human sin into the world, there was a hint for us about the origin of sin in the setting itself. Because when the story begins, the figure of the tempter is already present in the character of the serpent. Before the creation of Adam and Eve, there had come into existence the tempter. That means that the entrance of evil into the world has to be pushed back before Adam and Eve to a prior event involving a different set of beings. Sin was already present in creation before Adam and Eve chose to disobey, because a different being who was also self-aware, who also knew that he was not God, decided that he would try to change that situation so that he could be God. And when that failed, he turned his now twisted power in a different direction to try and convince humans to follow in his path. There's a second hint in the story that's also important to note. From the very start of the story, the most characteristic feature of the serpent is that he is utterly and irreconcilably opposed to God. That opposition to God indicates a condition that is presumed to be the case on every page throughout the rest of the Bible. The event that preceded the temptation in the garden, the event that led to this presumed condition of opposition to God, is pictured for us in the passage we just read this morning from the other end of the Bible, from Revelation. From the book of Revelation, chapter 12, verses 7 to 12, describe in a symbolic way this attempt by Satan, the dragon as he's pictured, to overthrow the throne of God. And in his rebellion, he led approximately 1/3 of the heavenly host in a battle against the rest of the angels. And for this rebellion, he was thrown out of heaven and exiled to the earth. And in that same passage, Satan, who's the leader of this angelic rebellion, is identified with the serpent of Genesis 2, said to be the deceiver of the whole world. Now, the angels that followed him in this rebellion are also known as fallen angels or demons. They are spiritual beings intent on using their power to oppose God. The Bible consistently portrays God as engaged in this cosmic battle in which his good creation is threatened by evil forces who are determined to destroy that which he has made, to thwart his intentions for his creations, especially people whom he created for relationship with himself. Which means that the scriptural narrative shows us that there is a powerful spiritual being who is intentionally trying to inflict suffering on people, attempting to increase the evil in the world because of his hatred for God, because of his opposition to God. And this being, known as Satan, leads a host of fallen angels who join him in his war against God and against the human race. Now, when it comes to the topic of angels and demons, there are a lot of superstitious ideas, and there's odd notions that are taken from folklore and from Hollywood scripts. I'm not going to go through all of the biblical teaching about angels and demons today. I do want to note a few crucial facts that are important for understanding how they factor into this discussion about suffering and evil. First of all, angelic beings of both sorts, angels and demons, are created beings. So, just like humans, they are dependent upon God for their continued existence. But they are spirits. They lack physical bodies. However, at times, they can appear in human form, and they are capable of engaging with human beings. And we see examples of that throughout the Old Testament and the New Testament. They also have very many capabilities that are comparable to human beings. For instance, we can see angels have personality, they have will, they have power, they have intelligence, including the ability to acquire and retain knowledge. And that capability is at least comparable to, if not superior to, human intelligence and human abilities. Their ability to communicate allows them to serve as messengers for God. We see lots of examples of this. Matthew 28 is one, Luke 1, the stories of Gabriel coming to Mary and to Elizabeth. Angels are part of God's good creation. They were created with the capacity, for instance, to worship and to exalt God with praise. Revelation 4 shows us this. So this power that angels have is something that can be wielded in various ways. They can influence, they can even exert a certain amount of control over human beings, over human society. In Psalm 103:20, there's a reference to angels as mighty ones, or some who are mighty in strength. 2 Peter 2:11 notes that angels are mightier than human beings in their power. We also see in the book of Daniel, chapter 10, through the first part of 11, Daniel's intercession on behalf of his people is a factor in a spiritual conflict that involves angelic forces, one of whom is described as having a kind of rulership over the Persian Empire, or perhaps just the Persian region of the world. So they can exert their power over human societies. The crucial thing to see in all of this is that angels and demons have the capacity for moral judgment and decision. They are able to know what is right and wrong, and they can act upon that knowledge. And we can see this by the fact that some of the angels sinned, this 1/3. They lost their place among God's host. Jude 6 tells us this, that the angels who did not keep their position of authority abandoned their proper dwelling. God is kept in darkness, bound with everlasting chains for judgment for the great day. So the fact that God judged the angels and punished them for their sin in this rebellion demonstrates that the ones who sinned acted intentionally. They possessed the capacity for moral judgment. They were responsible for their actions. Which means that all angelic beings, angels and demons, like humans, possess the capacity to choose. They have free will. And like humans, their actions have consequences. So just as God did not annul Adam's decision to disobey, but allowed the consequences of that action to stand, so too God did not annul Satan's decision to rebel, but allowed the consequences of that action to stand. That means that angelic sin and the consequences of angelic sin are part of this broken world. As a result of the sin of Satan in rebelling against God and the sins of the angelic hosts that follow him, there now exists in the spiritual realm something that God never intended. A spiritual realm of spiritual beings, demons, that are led by Satan, who are opposed to all that God is and all that he does and all that he wants for his creation. It was never God's intention for that to happen. Now, the consequences of Satan's action were massive. Two of them are particularly important for us to recognize today. First of all, as a consequence of his action, there came into being a kingdom of darkness. Satan's followers formed a hierarchy of sort with Satan at the lead. And his character, now corrupted by his evil choice, has shaped the nature of that over which he rules. And that kingdom is opposed to God, to his ways, to his people, and to God's rulership over his people. Secondly, then, another consequence that follows from this is that there's the inauguration of this cosmic war between these two opposing kingdoms. That initial rebellion in heaven is ongoing to the present day. As the kingdom of darkness battles against God's kingdom with evil intent, by evil means, including violence and deception and cruelty. Demons share Satan's malevolent intentions for God's creation. They share in his hatred and opposition to God. And that's particularly true when it comes to people. And so they harass and they deceive and they confuse and they oppress and they inflict harm on humans in numerous ways, including things like mental instability or physical diseases or disabilities, spiritual delusions. And their primary goal as far as humans are concerned, other than just to inflict suffering on them, is to dissuade people from learning about or following Christ. They're always working to try to stop that. Now, Satan cannot hurt God directly. And so, like a jilted lover, he directs his rage against God toward the destruction of God's image. He attacks that which God loves, his creation, especially people. He's fueled by hatred, fueled by pride, and in his rage, he vainly assumes that he can overthrow God, but he takes that out on people. He tries to overthrow God by overthrowing human beings. Now, this war that is ongoing, this is not the normal state of affairs. It's not like this is an eternal, everlasting, unchanging war. It's not the state of affairs through creation. It was not God's intention for the universe, but it does represent the presumed state of affairs that is on every page in the Bible. It is the way things are since Adam's fall into sin. Why does that matter? Because it's only Adam's sin that allowed humanity to become subject to that kingdom of darkness. Had Adam not sinned, that kingdom of darkness would have existed, but only in the angelic world. The greatness of Adam's sin is seen in this, that not only does it introduce evil into human history, corrupting the human race, but it opened a way for the demonic realm to invade and hold power over human beings. And that's one of the consequences of his sin. Now, I said in the very opening sermon in this series that blaming Satan as the cause of all suffering is an inadequate answer. It does not give us the full picture. Satan is neither the direct cause nor the indirect cause of all the suffering and the evil in the world. However, he is the cause, both directly and indirectly, of a lot of the suffering and the evil in the world. Because he influences humans through deception, through temptation, so that we act on our selfish lusts and desires. He doesn't give us those lusts, we have those. But he acts on us and tempts us with the result that we become trapped in sinful tendencies and habits and lifestyles. His temptations lure people, cause us to harm others or to harm ourselves through destructive ways. He deceives people, distorts the truth. He inspires the creation of deceptive belief systems, whether those beliefs are organized into some religious system or some philosophical system, or if they're just the fevered delusions of a paranoid individual. He suggests courses of actions. He gives us lies and half-truths, manipulates people. The result that a person's own sinfulness is reinforced and our choices to sin are magnified in the effects. Think of the person who wants to get rich and so starts a Ponzi scheme to defraud thousands of families, magnifying his sin and the effects and the consequences. Or the national leader who embarks on a war because he wants to enhance his political image and the death and destruction that come from that. Satan gains power over humans through our sins so that he can torment us with fears and delusions, with emotional, spiritual anguish, madness, with physical pain and suffering. And that demonic influence, that power in a person's life can actually become a spiritual stronghold, magnifying that individual's own capacity for evil and their receptivity to evil. And that when you have that kind of a stronghold in a person, it magnifies the strength of evil's hold over that person and makes them more resistant to the Spirit of God. So the net result of Satan's involvement in human history is the magnification of human capacity for evil and a corresponding increase in human suffering as a result. But you need to remember this. Satan's power, including his power over people, is not absolute. He is not God's equal. He does not have limitless, unrestricted access to people's life. If he did, he would possess every single individual on the planet. We would all be acting out like the Gadarene demoniac. So, it appears then that there is a natural protection given us by God that Satan cannot overcome apart from deliberate acts on our part that open us up to demonic influence and involvement. I used to tell people this. Demons are not like Snoopy sitting on his doghouse, ready to pounce upon people when they get out of the church house. Okay? Unless we take active steps to invite demonic involvement, we're not just subject to them unless we're, under the covering of the church. And this natural protection serves to limit his ability to harass and to influence and to control people. Aren't you glad? Aren't you glad that God is restraining him? I am. But you might ask then, well, if he's restraining him, why didn't he just destroy him before he could ever tempt Adam and Eve? It's a legitimate question. Well, part of the answer is related to what we just noted a little bit ago, that God made a real world in which choices have meaning because he allows the consequences of those choices to stand. And that includes the choices made by Satan and by the angels who followed him in that rebellion. Some of the answer to this question is going to be addressed in a few weeks in part 5. But there's a measure of this answer. Why didn't he just destroy him? It's really cloaked in mystery. God has not revealed everything to us, and so we have to be content with incomplete and imperfect knowledge. If that statement frustrates you, I absolutely understand how you feel. You just want to scream, no! Contentment with incomplete and imperfect knowledge goes against everything in me, almost everything in me. I am anything but content with incomplete and imperfect knowledge because eliminating incomplete and imperfect knowledge is one of the primary driving motivations in my life. So I get it. I understand if you're feeling frustrated. We want to know why. But I have learned that the God who made me, the God who loves me, is not only perfect in power and knowledge, he is perfect in kindness and wisdom. So he does not burden me with things that I cannot carry. And I have learned that I can trust him to tell me the things that I do need to know when I need to know them. Corrie ten Boom, the famous survivor of the Nazi concentration camp at Ravensbrück, learned this lesson from her father when she was still a young girl. And the scene is portrayed quite well in the movie about her life called The Hiding Place. Corrie confided in her father that she was frightened about the prospect of dying. And as she tells the story, Father sat down on the edge of the narrow bed. Corrie, he began gently, when you and I go to Amsterdam, when do I give you your ticket? I sniffed a few times in considering this. Why, just before we get on the train. Exactly. And our wise Father in heaven knows when we're going to need things too. So don't run out ahead of him, Corrie. When the time comes that some of us will have to die, you look into your heart and find the strength you need just in time. So let's summarize where we are. So far, we've seen that some of the pain and the suffering in the world can be explained simply as the result of the fact that the universe is real. It's not a fantasy. For the universe to be real, certain properties of the universe have to be constant. Actions have consequences. Those consequences don't evaporate simply because we didn't intend for them to happen. We don't want to experience them. So, for example, something that's hard or heavy or has a sharp edge can cause damage and pain if it falls and lands on my body. Okay? We've also seen that much of the pain and suffering in the world is due to the sinful choices of human beings. Those choices are freely made. And that God does not annul our choices or the consequences of those choices, even when those consequences bring suffering to us or to others. So, for example, the decision of a king or a government to invade a neighboring nation will bring great suffering to people in both nations. Psychological anxiety, economic hardships, separation of families, destruction of property, death. Similarly, the decision by an individual to pursue an adulterous affair will bring about pain and suffering to both persons involved, as well as their families and friends, and it could lead to financial hardships for them and for their families, for their companies and those who work with them, and so on and so on. And now today we've seen that some of the pain and suffering is due, whether directly or indirectly, to the involvement of Satan and his demons in the world. They attack people directly, cause mental and physical trauma or disease. They lure people into adopting false beliefs, to engaging in sinful behaviors. Those behaviors bring damage and suffering to themselves and to others. And so we could think, for instance, that ruler whose decision is, I'm going to invade this neighboring country, could be fueled by a hatred for that people group and this false notion that he was part of a superior race ordained by God to rule over these inferior people who live nearby. Now, sorting out those different explanations for why pain and suffering are in the world is helpful. Helps us categorize things a little bit, but they still leave us with our problem. Because we want to know why. We want an answer to our question. We want a diagnosis that not only explains how we got here, but offers us a solution we can use to eliminate our pain. We want a pill. But there's the rub, as Will Shakespeare would say, because those three explanations can overlap, and the strings that tie them together are many, and they are tangled, making it exceedingly difficult, if not impossible, for us to identify the reason that something happened. Let me illustrate. Take the examples that I just mentioned. Suppose an ambitious man from a tribe that has been historically oppressed by the majority powers rises to leadership in the military, and he then leads a coup that overthrows the existing government, establishes a dictatorship with himself at the head of the new government. The defeated leaders, all members of the majority tribe, they flee to the neighboring country for refuge. And the new king is determined to exterminate that tribe that formerly oppressed his family. So he accuses the neighboring country of conspiring against him, declares war against the nation, orders his army to pursue the former leaders, to attack every facility where they might be housed. And in that ensuing offensive, a missile carrying a warhead hits a hospital and explodes. The falling debris lands on the head of a young woman, a talented surgeon, and kills her. Her death leads to even more deaths, since she's not there to perform life-saving operations in the hospital for those who are wounded in the attack. But the only reason she was even in the hospital that was bombed was that she had taken the day off of work at her normal hospital to come and have lunch with her lover, with whom she'd been carrying on an adulterous affair for several years. Now, if this was the plot of a movie or a criminal forensics TV show, as the audience, we would want to know why she died. And the cast would be acting out our question for us as they attempted to solve the mystery of her death. Was it simply a case of being in the wrong place at the wrong time? Is it the result of the inexorable laws of physics playing out before us as gravity causes chunks of concrete and steel to fall with such force that they crush her, causing her organs to stop functioning? Was her death due to the actions of the military in carrying out the strike? Was it due to the decision of the tyrannical despot who ordered this attack to destroy his enemies? Was it due to the demonic spirit who whispered into his ear and fed his bitterness at being oppressed and suggested that he get revenge on his enemies? Or was it due to her sins, sins that led her to be somewhere that she otherwise would never have been? Now, in the movie or the TV show, the writers would probably leave us just with the mystery. But in real life, we want to know the reason, because not knowing nags at us. And like Job, we cry out to God, "Why me? What have I done?" But unfortunately, like Job, we are incapable of untying all those strings. And we're going to come back to that specific nagging question in a few weeks. But for the moment, let me simply offer you a little bit of practical advice. First of all, recognize that a lot of the pain around you and the pain inside of you has one or more of these three contributing factors. But without the benefit of omniscience, you're going to come up short when you try to nail down the reason for your pain. You might be able to identify some possible causes. You might even have a certain measure of accuracy in figuring out what those were. But you won't be able to see them all, and you won't be able to trace all those strings back to the point of origin. And that's the second thing you need to recognize. You might need to repeat it to yourself if necessary. Because you're not going to be able to find an answer that satisfies that itch for a diagnosis. To know for certain, it's simply beyond your reach. Because even when you have an accurate diagnosis, it doesn't put an end to the question, and like it or not, that's the truth. Which leads to number 3. Recognize that if you continue the search for a conclusive answer to the question of these specific causes of your personal pain, you will eventually discover, hopefully, that there is no end to that road. And so it's best to abandon the pursuit before you exhaust all of your energies in the futile effort at finding certainty. Let me caution you also, though, that you need to be very careful what you do at this point, because some of us will opt for a false sense of certainty. We say, well, this is what I choose to believe. This is what I believe is the cause of all my pain. Or we say, this is what I want to believe about the reason that whatever happened, because when I believe that, it kind of dulls all my pain. And both of those decisions will lead you astray, will lead you on a path that ends in self-designed religion rather than in the knowledge of God. So instead, may I recommend that you make a fairly simple, not necessarily easy, but a simple step. Take a simple step. That you lay the entire quest on the back shelf of your mind and leave it with God for later on. Don't throw it away. Just set it aside until later. There may come a point in your life when God will show you some of the answer. He may give you just enough information to allow you to keep setting it aside while you continue to seek God. So seek God, don't just seek answers. James 4:7 says, "Submit yourselves to God then, and resist the devil, and he will flee from you." Submit to God. Accept the fact that God does not owe you an explanation. and that you couldn't understand it if he would even give it to you. And then resist the devil. Treat him like an enemy, not like an attractive nuisance, not like a familiarity. Never forget that he only brings more pain, more heartache, more trouble. I was reminded this past week of a song that I learned in kindergarten. Let the sun shine in, face it with a grin. Right? How many of you know that old song? Yeah. Smilers never lose and frowners never win. But the verse is, my mama told me something a little boy should know. It's all about the devil, and I've learned to hate him so. He always causes trouble when you let him in the room. He will never, ever leave you when your heart is filled with gloom. Now, it's a song about trying to keep kids cheerful and not get grumpy. But there's truth in that. When you let the devil in, he only brings trouble. Despite what his face says and the sales pitch. Nothing that he says is true. Nothing that he offers will last or will satisfy. Submit to God, resist the devil's temptations and lies, and he will flee from you. That's how you have to respond when he starts feeding you lies about why bad things have been happening to you. So let's just sum up then what we've discovered about this portion of the answer, the question of why suffering exists, evil exists in this good world that God made. Number one, demonic evil is the result of angelic rebellion, some unknown time in the past prior to the temptation of Adam and Eve, and that evil introduced evil into God's creation. That is, that decision, that choice by Satan and the angels, introduced evil into God's creation, began a cosmic conflict between God and the kingdom of darkness, and it's led by Satan. Number two, because people are created in the image of God and are beloved by him, Satan and his demons seek to inflict pain and suffering upon people to destroy all that God loves, especially human beings and their relationships and their societies. And number three, demonic evil, though it's not unrestrained, is intertwined with and behind much of human suffering, so that suffering and evil are increased from what would otherwise be the case. So we have another piece of the puzzle, another part of the answer to the question of suffering and evil, and you might still feel like a little frustrated. That's okay. Just put that frustration back on that back shelf for a little bit longer. And then be sure to come back for the rest of the series, because God has an answer for you. I believe it with all my heart. And next week, in fact, is especially crucial. It's especially important. In the meantime, though, we're going to continue to walk by faith, to trust in this good God who loves us and who has showed it by giving us his Son.